This is Steve Cobb in Nashville, Tennessee on October 4th, 2002. I'm here to interview former Senator William J. Peeler for the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. For the record, sir, state your name.
William James Peeler.
And you're not the defendant here today.
Hopefully.
My first question, I guess, goes back to the beginning, Bill. I noticed from your resume that you were born in Michigan.
I was.
Now, how did a Yankee like that get all the way down here to Tennessee?
Well, the question is, how did a Confederate get up to Michigan? My father was up there working, and I was born, and I'm told that we left there when I was 9 months old and came back to his hometown, which is my hometown of McEwen, Tennessee.
Been in Tennessee ever since?
Ever since.
Tell me a little bit about your father and your mother then.
My father, as I told you earlier, died 32 years ago yesterday. He died at 82 years old. He was a businessman, a native of Humphreys County, involved in several businesses. My mother was a native of Humphreys County, and she died 1984, I believe it was, when she was 85 years old.
And was she also from Tennessee?
Yes, she was a native of Humphreys County.
Both, all right. Grandparents?
Well, my grandfather, Eli Peeler, William Eli Peeler, my father's father, was born in 1861 in Humphreys County and died in 1892 in Humphreys County. My grandmother, I can't recall, my grandmother Peeler, I cannot recall the date of her birth, but she died, I remember, in 1934. She was also a native of Humphreys County. My mother's father was a man named Eugene Wells. He was a native of Humphreys County, as was his wife, Cora Wells, who was a native of Humphreys County.
Where does the family come from?
My family came, excuse me.
No, go ahead. I wondered where your family came from originally.
Well, my family originally came from North Carolina. They came to Humphreys County in 1810. Settled on a revolutionary land grant that had been granted to my great-grandfather's grandfather. They remained in Humphreys County all their life. They were farmers. I think the 1850 census showed that he was a tanner, in addition to being a father. My father's mother's father was an old country doctor named Dr. Aaron James, and he was a native of Dixon County, come to think of it.
Long way away.
Long way away. And he had a son for whom I'm named. He was an old country doctor also, named Dr. William James, and he was a native of Humphreys County, but died in Dixon County, in Bon Aqua, Tennessee. So they've been around a long time.
Sounds like it.
Never done anything of note, but they were good, sturdy people.
Now, Humphreys County, does that have an H on the front of it?
Yes, it does.
Is the H pronounced?
No, it's pronounced Humphreys.
That's how you know if you're from that area.
Absolutely. Humphreys County was named for an old circuit judge named Perry W. Humphrey, and it was became a county in 1809.
Any idea where the H got lost?
No, I have no earthly idea.
But if somebody says
if somebody
Humphreys
says they're
County,
from Humphreys County,
you know
they're not
city.
from Humphreys County.
Well, tell me a little bit about your childhood. What are your first memories there in Humphreys County?
Well, I was an only child. Well, that's not exactly correct. My mother and father had a child who died as an infant, but I was born 2 years later. I grew up in the little town of McEwen.
Where'd you go to school?
Went to school to McEwen Elementary School and McEwen High School. Very uneventful childhood, very happy childhood. Some people used to say, how did you feel to be an only child? I said, well, I enjoyed every moment of it.
I understand there were only 15 people in your high school graduating class?
I think that's an exaggeration. I really think there were 9. But I'll go with that. It makes it sound better. There were 15.
So this wasn't a one-room log cabin school?
No. What happened, the reason there were such very few people in my high school class was, back in those days, in 1945, when you got to be 18 years of age, you went to the Army. So a large number of my classmates had already went to the service. Now, I guess the reason I didn't was because of the fact that for some reason they let me start school when I was 5 years old. So most of my classmates were a year older than I, and those who were of my same age, I was a year ahead of them in school. So that was why there were so many. So few in my class, was so many had gone to the service.
And that was 1945?
1945, right.
Just after the war. You later went to Cumberland, I believe. Cumberland University?
Cumberland
Tell
University.
us a little bit about that. How did you choose to go that long distance over to Lebanon?
Well, there were a number of reasons. I guess one of the reasons, perhaps the first reason that I started giving it serious consideration, my father had a half-brother who was an educator of some renown, and he thought that Cumberland would be a good fit for me. So I started thinking about it, and then when a boy who I grew up next door to and who he and I later became law partners, he was already at Cumberland. And then virtually every lawyer that I knew were graduates of Cumberland. So that was, I guess, my uncle having suggested it to my father, and then my boyhood friend having already gone over there, I guess.
Did you consider any place else, UT or?
No, I really didn't. I really didn't. I had always been a great fan of Vanderbilt, but I just didn't feel that it would be a good fit for me, or at least my uncle didn't think it would be a good fit.
And you went there both as an undergraduate and to law school?
Yes.
And you graduated from law school in what year?
1952.
A lot of changes have happened to Cumberland since then, haven't they?
Yes. As you may or may not know, Steve, Cumberland is an old school, a lot of history, particularly in the legal profession. But except for a few years prior to the Civil War and just a few years about the turn of the century, they had some salad days, but virtually ever since it's been on the ropes financially. In recent years, it went through a period of time when I thought they were even going to close the law school. When I was there, in the 1950s, I believe that the Southern Baptists had Cumberland. Ward Belmont closed, and the Southern Baptists bought Ward Belmont and named it Belmont College. For all practical purposes, what we used to call the lit school ceased to operate, and it was just the law school. And then sometime, I guess it was in the late 50s, early 60s, it attempted to make a comeback and did to some degree. Finally, Bob Clement went over there, if you recall, it was president of Cumberland. I forget just when that was, but it's doing pretty good right now, much better than it has in a long time.
Now, didn't the law school move, though?
Where?
Is there still a law school at Cumberland?
Oh, excuse me. Yes, of course. The law school moved to Samford University in Birmingham.
When did this take place? After your time there, I guess.
I want to say, please don't hold me to this, but I think it was sometime around 59 or 60 that it moved to Birmingham, where it's done remarkably well because they've had the resources to hip it along, among other things.
Now, when did you do your military service? I see you were in the Army.
Went in the Army in February of 1946. I was discharged, as I recall, and I do recall, in July of 1947.
And that was before you went off to college?
Yes. Yes.
Did you ever think of doing anything but being a lawyer? I mean, you said one of your relatives had been a doctor. What made you think about going into the law? Did you know lawyers when you were a youngster?
I recall, as a very, very young person, I think either my father or my mother had suggested to me that I might want to be a doctor. Well, I nursed that idea for about 2 days.
No pun intended.
That's right. No pun intended. Until about 2 days when I saw some blood and I said, doctor's not for me. So virtually I wanted to be a lawyer all my life.
And you went straight from college to law school, no break?
No, I went to undergraduate school.
I mean, from college. When you finished your college,
Oh, yeah,
you went immediately into law school?
Yes, yes.
Never had a doubt, never a hesitation?
Never was a moment's hesitation. Okay. And hasn't been until this good day.
Nothing, I hope, has changed your mind today?
Nothing.
Good.
As a matter of fact, when I see these magnificent offices, I just wish that I was 50 years younger, where I could maybe be a part of this.
We'll be glad to put you to work after the interview.
Thank you.
What kind of things did you do outside of your schooling during this period? What interested you?
Well, you and I have known one another a long time, and I think you've known that I've had an interest in politics.
Yes, it came to my attention.
Virtually all of my life. And even as a very young, my father was never held elective office, but he liked politics, and I sort of grew up on it and enjoyed it very much.
Anything in the way of sports that was a particular interest to you?
Sports?
Yeah. Hobbies?
Well, I like to read. I never went hunting. I never went fishing. I never was really. We used to play tennis when I was a kid. That was about the extent of my athletic activities.
Well, I see that you were a member of the City Council, McEwen. It looks like you were doing that at the same time you were at Lebanon as an undergraduate. Am I right?
That's correct.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, let's see, when was it?
I've got 1948 to 1950.
I think that's right. It was, there were a few of us younger fellows who decided that we knew how to run a little town better than our elders did, and was elected. First time I ever voted, I voted for myself. 21 years old you had to be back in those days.
How old were you when you ran? I could do the
21.
math. You were 21 on the nose.
And got elected, and we had our go at it, and we had some degree of success. But I think we finally realized that maybe our elders really knew better how to run a little town than we did.
It's amazing how much dumber we get as we get older.
Absolutely.
How big was McEwen when you were on the city council? What was the population?
I think it was about 650 people or something like that.
How often did your city council meet?
Oh, we met very often. We met about once a week. I don't know what the regular meetings should have been, probably once a month, but we met regularly.
How big was the city council?
Oh, gosh. I think there were 5.
5 people?
Yes.
Met once a week. And you must have been paid a princely salary, I'm sure?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Anything at all?
No, of course
If you're a
not.
volunteer? Yeah. I see you didn't run again for that. Or if you
That's true.
did, you didn't get elected.
Well, no, I didn't run again. Had, as I said earlier, we decided maybe that our elders knew better how to run a town than we did, and then too, I was dealing with law school and whatever, and had married too in the time.
When did you get married?
December 26, 1949.
And your wife was Nancy?
Nancy.
Nancy Bradley Peeler.
Right.
We'll come back to your family a little bit more later, but when you left the city council, you had apparently greater targets in mind. I see you ran for and were elected president of the Young Democrats of Tennessee.
Yeah, I believe that was in 1951, I think.
Right, and you were there president for several years?
2 years.
Is it
two-year term.
2-year term?
1951, 1953.
And once again, you didn't run again?
No, it was sort of an unwritten rule that you would serve one term as president of Young Democrats, and then you would stand aside for somebody.
Let somebody else do, have the fun. But your political career wasn't over. Soon thereafter, you ran for the House of Representatives.
Right.
Do you recall when that was? Late 50s, 1958?
1958.
And were you elected the first time?
Yes, sir.
Did you have opposition, or did the...
Yes, yes.
Tell me a little about the campaign, your first real campaign like that.
Well, I don't know if you ever lived in a small town or community or not, but small town politics can be very interesting, sometimes very personal. And it's been my experience that you always inherit your parents and your in-laws' enemies, but you sure don't inherit their friends. You have to earn that friendship. Well, there was a gentleman in our town who was a former district attorney general, and he and my father-in-law didn't get along too well, so his name was Rita Parker, God rest his soul, and a great lawyer. And Rita recruited a young man who was originally from our county, but at that particular time was living in Texas. But he came back to run for the legislature against me, and as I campaigned, somebody would say, "Well, son, who's running against you?" I said, "A fellow from Texas." He said, "Texas?" "Yeah, a fellow from Texas." "Who's that?" "Well, I tell you." And I looked up and got elected.
Do you recall how close the election was?
I won a pretty good majority.
Good. A very confident way you put that. Now, when you went to the House of Representatives, how many people did you represent? Do you remember? How big was the district back then?
Well, I had two counties, and it was in the days before reapportionment.
Before Baker versus Carr.
Yes. As a matter of fact, Baker versus Carr, I think, came down in 61, 62. But, you know, the main reason that I run for the legislature, other than the fact I just like politics, was to get a general sessions court in Humphreys County. In those days, general sessions courts were created by private act. And of course, in order to pass a private act, you had to have both your representative and your senator.
Mm-hmm.
We could never get the representative and the senator at the same time to introduce a private act. As I said, I got elected. I introduced a private act to create a general sessions court in Humphreys County. Our then senator, who was also from Humphreys County, immediately killed the bill.
Why would he do that?
Because he was a justice of the peace who tried lawsuits.
He didn't want any competition.
He didn't want a general sessions court. And not just necessarily because of that, but I think philosophically there was a lot of people who felt that really justices of the peace were the best arbiters of little small offense claims in rural communities. Well, my bill having been killed, the Bar Association, the Tennessee Bar Association, had been trying to pass a statewide general sessions bill forever. As I recall, Lon McFarland was the president of the State Bar Association. I go to Lon, Harlan Dodson, Harlan Jr., all several of them. They said, "Well, you know, if you want to try it, fine, but you can't pass it." And I said, well, will you all help me if I introduce the bill? And they said, yeah, of course we will, but we're just telling you, you can't pass it. Well, it wasn't anything that I did, but as you well know, Steve, legislation sometimes just has a way of coming of age. This bill had been around forever. I introduced the bill. We passed it in the House. I think out of the 95 counties, there were about, in addition to the counties who already had sessions courts, and they exempted a few. I remember Polk County, Stewart County. Anyway, we wound up with about 88 counties in Tennessee with the General Sessions Court. Unfortunately, Humphreys County wasn't one of them.
Your senator still had some power.
Got to the Senate, under the senatorial courtesy, he moved to exclude Humphreys County, thinking that I know that when it came back to the House that I would refuse to concur and he would kill my bill. But when it came back to the House, I concurred in it, and we had a statewide General Sessions Court.
That's quite an achievement.
And then 2 years later, I had to run again in order to get a General Sessions Court in Humphreys County.
Had the senator gone on
He had gone
by that time
that
to
was
other?
in the days when it was sort of a rotation deal. There were 4 counties. He served 1 2-year term.
That was back when the senators were serving 2-year terms.
That's right.
And the House members 2-year terms.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about the justices of the peace. Many of the younger lawyers, and I'm even going to claim I'm in that group as far as knowledge about justices of the peace is concerned, won't really know what you're talking about. We've all heard it, but who were they? How did they get chosen? What powers did they have?
Well, justices of the peace were members of the county court. They had legislative authority, and they also had the quote unquote judicial authority to hear certain small claims.
Was this established by private act or by statute or the Constitution?
This goes back, this was the general law. As a matter of fact, I think, and please don't hold me to this, but I think one of the first General Sessions courts in Tennessee was in Davidson County, and as I recall, that was in 34 or 36. Now, that's a long time ago, but relatively speaking, it's fairly recent. JP, Justice of the Peace, you say JP stands for Judgment for the Plaintiff. You know, you would sort of forum shop. Most every lawyer had his own Justice of the Peace. And the one that got to bring the lawsuit, he would generally select his own lawyer, own Justice of the Peace. You also, the Justice of the Peace, the county sheriff would generally have himself a Justice of the Peace of 1 or 2. And then to win a lawsuit, a criminal case, a Justice of the Peace court was indeed a rarity.
So they had both criminal and civil jurisdiction.
Yes,
What were the limits of the civil jurisdiction, or were there any?
Well, as I recall, Steve, I think they had jurisdiction up to $50. They could try a civil matter up to $50, as I recall.
And on criminal cases?
Primarily misdemeanors, issue minimuses, to commit people to jail.
So these folks were the members of the local county legislative body.
Absolutely.
Legislators who were acting in a judicial capacity.
That's absolutely true.
At the very same time, the county judge, who was the chief executive officer, was also had probate jurisdiction.
Probate jurisdiction,
juvenile
and
court
jurisdiction in most instances. And in some instances, I know in my county, and I learned this to my great dismay the hard way, in some instances they had habeas corpus jurisdiction.
Remarkably like a parliamentary system.
Somewhat.
In Great Britain. The separation of powers was not
somewhat blurred.
Somewhat blurred, shall we
Right.
say, back then. And of course, that was before the rules of civil procedure.
Oh, absolutely.
Tell us a little bit about that as well.
About the rules of civil procedure?
No, we've all heard of the rules of civil procedure. What was it like before they came along?
Marvelous. Those of us who went to school before the rules of civil procedure came along, we did quite well. You know, demurs, vis vir coram nobis. But I remember, I believe it was in 1968. Jim Center from Humboldt, Tennessee, was president of the State Bar Association. He had a young son named Jim Jr. who was just out of law school. I think he went to UT. And the law school professors were agitating for the rules of civil procedure because it was supposed to make things much more equitable, much more simple, and whatever. Gail Malone, who was a member of the legislature from Gibson County, and was a great friend of Jim Center Sr. Jim had lobbied him to be for the rules of civil procedure. Well, I was opposed to it. Frank Gorell was opposed to it. Bill Baird was opposed to it, which was all in the Senate. Gail broke his ankle, was out about 3 weeks, came back up to the house one day, cold wintertime, in a wheelchair, white as this shirt, beads of perspiration popping out on his forehead. Calls me over to the House chamber. And he said, "Peter, we've been friends a long time, haven't we?" I said, "Sure have, Gail." "I've never asked you to do a damn thing for me, haven't I?" I said, "No. I want you to do me a favor. Will you do it?" I said, "Well, of course I will if I can." He said, "You can do it. Will you do it?" I said, "Yes. I want you to vote for the rules of civil procedure." I said, "Oh, hell, Gail, don't ask me that. You've said you'd do it. I'm holding you to it." Well, I wasn't too worried about it because I knew it had to get 17 votes in the Senate, and I didn't think it had much chance of getting 17 votes in the Senate. But bless Pat, that's exactly what it got, was 17 votes in the Senate. Buford Ellington sent word, he was governor, sent word to Frank Gorell and myself, said, "If either one of you will ask me to veto this bill, I will." I go back to Gail, and I said, "Gail, turn me loose. I'm not doing it. You promised. I'm holding you to your word." That's how we got the rules of civil procedure when we got them.
Tell me why the legislature was involved in it. I know from personal experience that they're still involved in a certain manner. They approve the rules these
Right.
days or disapprove. They've chosen not to get into the business of amending them. But how did we start with the rules of civil procedure for courts in a legislative measure?
You know, I can't tell you the history of that, Steve, because I'm not really sure. I don't know. I assume that maybe that the Supreme Court at that time, and I remember some of the members at that time, were not too much in favor of the rules of civil procedure themselves. And so that was the only avenue left available to those who were advocates of it.
Do you recall any involvement of the Supreme Court in
No, I
the
don't.
in the
I
process
really,
then?
I cannot recall it personally.
Most of us have heard of that era as the time in which the governor almost totally dominated the legislature. Was that accurate?
By the time the rules of civil procedure came along, it was not nearly so accurate as it had been, say, 5 or 6 years earlier, prior to the Baker versus Carr. I think you first begin to see some erosion of the governor's influence with the legislature, and I use that word advisedly because even today, you know, the governor's got a lot of influence with the General Assembly. But prior to that, it was almost, you know, it was almost dictatorial. I think you began to see a change in that probably in 1966 if you remember, that was the time that Frank Garrell first run for Speaker of the Senate, and Jared Maddox and the legislature was stalemated for what, 22 or 3 days, deadlocked.
Now, Jared Maddox was the candidate of the governor.
That's right. That's right.
And heretofore, if the candidate of the governor was named, he was elected.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we had a firebrand revolutionary in Frank Garrell.
Well, he almost pulled it off and did 2 years later.
Now, by this time, you were in the Senate. You were
Yes.
no longer in the House. You had been out for what, 4 years?
4 years.
Why did you drop out for 4 years? Or was
Well,
it just
back in those days, it was sort of I had what was called a floterial representative district. It was sort of understood that you floated with the county, and you would have it for 2 terms, and then you would drop out, and the other county would have it for 2 terms.
From the other
So
county?
I had served my 2 terms.
So you dropped out and let the other fellow
Let the
have
other
it.
fellow have it.
And then you ran for the Senate.
All right.
Was that one county then still?
No, I think I had 8 or 9 counties for that time.
Okay, and you were elected first in 1966.
Right.
Were there still 2-year terms in, or were you 4-year terms by that point?
2-year term when I first elected.
Okay. When did they change? Do you recall?
1970, I believe.
Okay. And so you ran for a couple of terms as a 2-year and then one 4-year term.
Right.
In the meantime, were you practicing law?
Yes.
When did the legislature meet back then?
Oh, always. The legislature always convenes on the first Tuesday in January, second Tuesday in January. And when I first went to the legislature, it was virtually 2.5 calendar months every other year. By the time I was in the Senate, the so-called courtesy things about one county having it for 1 term, another had evaporated. And we started meeting annually.
How many months did you meet back then when they got to annual sessions?
Oh, you would probably go, as a general rule, to April.
So particularly at first, when there was only every other year, this didn't interfere with your practice too much. Tell us about what happened when you graduated from law school. Did you set up your own practice? You go in with somebody?
Yes, I did. Well, not really. I went in with a boy named Bill Murray, who was a graduate of Cumberland, originally from Louisiana, came to Waverly.
Classmate of yours?
No, he was a little ahead of me, but he and I formed a partnership and continued in that partnership until 1967, when he died very unexpectedly at 41 years of age with a heart attack, and a massive heart attack.
I noticed you said Waverly, and I know you're there now. Been out to your offices. Why not McEwen?
Well, there just wasn't an awful lot of legal business in McEwen in those days.
Well, how big is Waverly?
Oh, Waverly was a real metropolis. I guess in those days, Waverly had probably 3,500, 4,000 people.
Well, they certainly
Probably doesn't have many more than that now.
certainly need at least 2 good lawyers out
Right.
there then. And you set up your practice then in Waverly in what year?
1952.
And you're still there today?
Yes.
2002. 50 years.
50 years ago, 2nd day of August of this year. And incidentally, just got in the mail yesterday from the American Bar Association, a 50-year pin. Have you seen one of them? It's quite attractive.
Now, is Waverly also in Humphreys County?
It is. It's in Humphreys County. It's the county seat.
Stay close to home then.
Absolutely.
What kind of work did you do at first
As a lawyer,
as a lawyer?
everything. You tried every sort of lawsuit imaginable. I was admitted to the bar on the 2nd day of August, 1952. On the 18th day of August, 1952, I started a murder case that lasted for 5 days. Case of State versus Benefield. Not hardly the travesty of justice that it might appear, because my client, Henry Benefield, was an escaped convict from Alabama. And his family had hired a lawyer from Alabama to help defend him. And my partner, Bill Murray, with whom I had formed a partnership, had been appointed to represent him. Well, the lawyer from Alabama thought it was only appropriate that the Tennessee lawyers, the Waverly lawyers, take the lead. And Bill Murray didn't like to try lawsuits. Well, it was right down my alley. He tried the lawsuit for 5 days. I wish I could tell you he was acquitted, but I can't.
Well, sometimes the facts interfere with what would otherwise be a good story.
But at least this was a victory of sorts, because the state was seeking the death penalty. And the jury gave him life, which in those days was 13 years and 7 months.
That is quite a victory.
I'll never forget this particular case. He and a paramour named Lucile from Mayfield, Kentucky, had been on sort of a Bonnie and Clyde escapade. And when they were caught and charged with this murder, as sometimes happened, they each tried to blame it on the other. And I remember, in an effort to discredit Lucile, we had proven that she had had an illegitimate child, which was not looked upon with much favor, particularly in those days. And we found an old photograph that our client had that if you really stretched your imagination, might could have been said to be a little pornographic. But Lucile was represented by an old former district attorney general named Bill Howell, who was a tremendous trial lawyer. He'd been defeated after about 32 years in office, as I recall. And he defended Lucile. And if I live to be 100, and I'm not that far away, I'll never forget his closing argument. There was a man on the jury, a great big fat fellow, that I took because he was a friend of my mother and father's, and I thought he might look with favor upon me to help out his old friend's son. But his mother had died about 3 or 4 weeks prior to this trial starting. General Howell said in his closing argument, "Gentlemen of the jury, what have they proven on little Lucile? That she's a mother. The sweetest, most precious word in the English tongue. One of the most precious memories that I have. Because a little old lady." Did I do that?
I have no idea. That was a very dramatic story, and I guess fate meant you had to have some background music.
I guess.
But anyway.
Well, anyway, he was saying that of these memories that he had of his mother sitting on the front porch, singing those sweet old hymns.
We should probably cue the hymns now, shouldn't we?
Beg pardon?
We should probably cue the hymns.
Cue the hymns. And he said, "When my time shall come for me to meet my Maker, that the streets of gold nor the gates of jasmine shall hold no attraction to me, but to see once again that little old lady with the shawl wrapped around her shoulders, singing a charge to keep have I." When he said that, this fellow named Coleman, he just didn't start cheering up. He exploded. I mean, he was a fat man anyway. But I'll never forget that argument. Most effective argument for that particular time and point I think I ever heard.
So you knew Lucile was in good shape.
Little Lucile was in good shape. I thought Benefield and I both were going to the electric chair.
And that was just after you started practicing.
all of 16 days.
Well, you must have had some other interesting stories after that. Or was that the high point? 16 days in?
Everything was always downhill from that. No, I've had some interesting.
What's the most memorable case? Or is Lucile the most memorable?
Well, of course, it made an enormous impression on me. First case I ever tried before a jury was a murder case. You know, in those days, people would come to court. It was a form of entertainment. And the courthouse was full, so it made an indelible impression upon me. Shortly thereafter, I tried another murder case, which is somewhat infamous in Tennessee, State versus Nichols. Case lasted really commencing in October of 1954. Now, we were not in actual trial all this time, but actually ended in January of 55. And this is when I learned, to my chagrin, about our county executive having habeas corpus jurisdiction. Because when that private act was passed, giving the county executive habeas corpus jurisdiction, our county executive, our county judge, was a lawyer, and a very fine lawyer. But he had long since died, and our county executive, county judge at that time was not a lawyer. So we filed a motion for habeas corpus, and Judge Chester Hart, or was it Judge Charlie Gilbert? Judge Charlie Gilbert's court, I think. Seeking to read a habeas corpus, and they came in and found and said, oh no, county judge in Umphress County's got jurisdiction. So we had to.
You went down there?
Yeah, sure did.
That must have been an interesting experience.
It was a very interesting experience. Sure.
Talking about something like that with a non-lawyer.
Well, we didn't do too well. There again, it was JP, judgment for the plaintiff, judgment for the state. Could have been JS.
What did you learn from the little Lucile case? Did you change anything about how you did things after that? We all pick up a little bit at each case, but anything stand out in your mind?
From little Lucile case, I don't know of anything we could have done differently. It wasn't any question of plea bargaining. I mean, they were seeking the electric chair, and so you had really everything to gain, nothing to lose.
Did you specialize in criminal law?
No.
Bill,
you know, in a country practice, you can't specialize. You know, you try everything.
So you did wills and you tried cases?
Wills, tried will contest cases, tried criminal cases, tried tort cases.
Ever have a boundary dispute?
Oh, many. Tell you, I've got one now that the court has had in its bosom for close to 30 years. Never been decided.
An ongoing case held under
I can't say
advised?
it's ongoing, but
Under advisement, perhaps?
the way this came about, Barney Region was chancellor. And we tried the case before Barney. Barney took it under advisement. And while he had it under advisement, Bill Hall ran against Barney for chancellor and beat him. Well, it had been beyond the 60 or 90-day, I forget what the statute says, that the court can hold it and still decide after they leave office. So we had to try it again before Bill, Chancellor Hall, I should say. Well, he had it under advisement, and he got killed in an automobile accident. Well, Chancellor Darnell from Clarksville then took office, and we tried to try it before Chancellor Darnell. And then they changed the Chancery Division after he had it under advisement. Judge Allen Wallace, now Judge Allen Wallace, who was practicing attorney at the time, he was opposing counsel. So when they changed the Chancery Division, Judge Darnell had held it in the bosom of the court beyond the 60 days. I forget exactly what the proceeding was. I think he had issued some memorandum opinion with it,
But no order yet?
No, and then either Wallace or myself, I forget which, filed a Rule 60 motion, Rule 60B motion. He took it under advisement. Never decided it. Judge Leonard Martin, who later became chancellor and still is, signed an order electing Chancellor Darnell for the express purposes of deciding the case. It hadn't been decided yet.
Just out of curiosity, are the parties still alive?
Most of them are not. Most of them are deceased.
Shoot each other over the boundary dispute?
The whole piece of land just holding the world together anyway.
Yes. Well, let me take you back to the legislature. You're in the Tennessee State Senate, and 1974 is coming along. You decide not to run again. I remember that well personally. Why did you not want to run again?
Well, there were several reasons. One is that I had found that as my law practice grew, and as my partner's law practice grew, I found myself facing more and more conflicts. You know, we had clients within a given industry doing something and what have you. And then, too, our law practice had grown to the extent that it was interfering seriously with it because the legislature was beginning to meet more and more and more often with committee meetings and what have you. And then, too, I had been running virtually all of my life, and I was tired. I had a 9-county area. And, you know, I had Williamson County on the south and east. We went all the way to the Alabama line in the south, all the way down to Henderson County in the west. I almost should have been running for Congress.
It sounds like a congressional district.
Yeah,
That's a huge area.
A huge area. 9 counties was a big area in which to run. So I decided that I should probably hang it up. And I did. And I missed it, but I'm not sorry that I did.
By that time, the legislature had become independent of the governor's office
Pretty well so.
and was meeting quite a lot.
Well, yes, and in particular, my last 4 years, Steve, I was a majority leader in the Senate. And we had a Republican governor, Governor Dunn. So we were, you know, we were sort of feeling our way, having declared our independence. We were saying, now what are we going to do with it? So it was taking more and more time.
And the legislature was developing new institutions like the Fiscal Review Committee and other things like that.
Fiscal Review was a little bit before the time, but yeah.
Well, I understand that you have been back to Capitol Hill a time or two since your last days of service there as a senator.
Yep.
Done a little lobbying on occasion.
Done a little.
How was that to switch from being a member? What were you paid the princely sum of $8,600 a year, I think?
Back in, I don't know what the legislature
Something
paid
like
me.
that.
It wasn't very little. But it never even dawned on me about doing any lobbying work. Just, you know. Back in those days, there were 3 principal lobbyists. Matt Lynch, representing labor.
President of the Central Labor Council
Right.
for Tennessee.
Keith Short, representing the Coca-Cola people out of Jackson. and Lewis Allen represented the railroad, and they were there all the time. And then you had other lobbyists, but they were, not there that much. So I got a call from 3M one day in November of '74, as I recall, and said they wanted to come down and see me. And I said, well, that's fine, but I'd be happy to come to Nashville or come to Minnesota. No, we want to come to Waverly. They came to Waverly and asked me about representing them, and I said, well, I'm honored and flattered, but I've never done anything like this before. Don't know whether I can do it or not. So we came to a meeting of the minds, and I'm still representing them since 1974. What's that, 28 years? Yes, sir.
Had you had no contact with 3M before that?
Virtually none. Virtually none. I had met a fellow named John Milne, whom I liked very much. I had been to St. Paul with some legislators, Jim McKinney, whom you remember, and two or three others I can't remember, but that was virtually all.
The first bill you lobbied for them was reflectorized license plates. Right. Tell us a little bit about that struggle.
Well, it was a struggle. We passed the bill, and then had an awfully time getting it implemented. Took about 2 or 3 years to get it implemented.
I've got to tell you a story ever so briefly. I had, as you know, just been elected as a young representative then, and I'll never forget that debate on the reflectorized license plate. You had talked McKinney or some of your folks into talking about how this was going to provide more jobs for the people in the prisons. And I'd been very interested in that and stood up and spoke in favor of your bill because I was persuaded by that argument. Came out, didn't know you from a hole in the ground at the time. Came out, I'd heard of your name, but we hadn't met. And you invited me to dinner, and I was a little surprised, couldn't figure out why you wanted to take me to dinner. I was very honored, but I was in law school at the time, so I had to beg off. But that's that's a little bit like the little Lucile case. That's a very fond memory I have.
I remember when you were there as a student at Vanderbilt. Were you a student then, or were you teaching?
No, I'd been teaching at TSU before in sociology, and I went back to law school.
And so you were in law school when this happened?
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
First year law school.
Yeah, I remember.
What's a lobbyist do? Tell us, for those souls out there who had no contact with the legislature.
Well, of course, I really, Steve, feel like that the lobbyist's job, if he does it correctly, is simply to make available, obviously, most information, obviously most favorable to his client, to the legislature, to the individual legislators. And I think he's got to be, he or she, as the case might be, scrupulously honest with the legislature. Because if he's not, if they catch him or she misleading them, giving them intentionally false information, then I think that person's credibility is destroyed and his effectiveness as a lobby is over. So whether that answers your question or not, I don't know. But it's really a job, as I said, I think, to provide information to the legislature. Obviously, that information which is most favorable to the client.
And there are probably situations which are more pleasant than others to convey information, perhaps at dinner or
oh yes, of course,
over a drink.
That's no longer the case much anymore. Used to be, but now you have to invite either a subcommittee or a committee. Or
you didn't have to register back then either, did you?
No, as a matter of fact, I cannot recall, but it seems to me that I think you did have to my first year of lobbying. Don't hold me to that, but I think you did. So if not the first year, shortly thereafter, and file a expense report and everything.
Tell us about the legislators from your point of view then. Do they do a good job? What do they base their decisions on? Are they too controlled by lobbyists, the administration?
I don't think so. I think even in my very earliest days of being around the legislature, and that goes back to 1951 or thereabouts, as an employee, I think most legislators had a desire to do good for their constituents. I think that's still true. Now, admittedly, some of us have different ways of interpreting how you can best do good. But I think, all in all, we have, most members of the General Assembly are very honorable. Most of them are somewhat knowledgeable, some obviously more than others, people. And I still feel that way very strongly.
Did you work with legislator staffs, or did they even have a staff?
Well, we're just commencing to have staff. Yeah, you would work with staff some.
But each legislator doesn't have a legislative assistant and an executive assistant and all the other things we're used to with congressmen, does he?
No, but I think virtually every legislator now has a secretary, or at least access to a secretary.
In the early 50s, did you all have offices?
Absolutely not.
Where did you do your work? On the floor?
On the floor. Committee meetings were held sometimes on the floor after the session, and there was an awful lot of work done in the lobby of the Hermitage Hotel, then the lobby of the Andrew Jackson Hotel at night.
And if you needed to send a letter to a constituent, how'd you get that typed?
You didn't unless you could find some, they would bar state employees.
If you were in good terms with the governor.
Well, yeah, that's basically it. Because you didn't get a lot of mail in those days. You got some, and what you generally do is when you go home, you get your secretary at home to answer the letters.
You all opened up the War Memorial Building, didn't you, about your last term in the Senate?
I think it's 1970. I think it's
so you finally had offices over there.
Right. That's right. And secretaries. Not everybody. John Wilder, Ed Blank, and myself shared a secretary.
John Wilder,
who was Speaker.
Was at that time Speaker of the Senate, right. And therefore Lieutenant Governor.
All right.
And 32 years later, John Wilder is Speaker of the Senate and Lieutenant Governor.
Right.
Ed Blank, tell us a little about what you remember about Ed.
Oh, he was a great, great human being. Great tragedy that he died so young. Ed was caucus chairman back in those days, and I was majority leader. He was just a prince of a fellow. It's a great tragedy that he enormous talent.
Let me ask you one final question before we take a break. Did you all go home every night after the session, or did you all stay here in a hotel?
Oh, I stayed here. Waverly was just far enough away that you could not really commute. It's about an hour and a half drive from Nashville to Waverly. And even so today with interstate it is.
Now back in the 50s, Bill, they had two famous hotels. I think even in the late 60s, the Andrew Jackson and the Hermitage. Was there any divisions about who got to stay where?
Strangely there was. And I don't know how, I don't really know how it developed. I have my ideas, but I don't know definitely. If you remember, Steve, back, well, probably you don't remember, but in the 50s, late 40s, early 50s, you had basically three political parties in Tennessee. You had the Republican Party, which was limited primarily to Upper East Tennessee. And then you had two factions of the Democratic Party. You had the Gordon Browning, Estes Kefauver faction. And for some reason, they always stayed in the main at the Andrew Jackson. And then you had the Mr. Crump, Frank Clement, Buford Ellington faction. For some reason, they always stayed at the Hermitage. Now, I don't know how that came about, unless it's just maybe that they struck a deal with various managers for their headquarters or something, and then just continued to stay.
Where'd you stay?
Well, I stayed at both of them.
Ah. It's the duty of the majority leader to bring the party together.
Well, no, in the later years I stayed at Hermitage because the Andrew Jackson was torn down, if you remember. When did that torn down?
I think that was probably about late 60s.
I think you're right.
No, early 70s when they built the Tennessee Performing Arts Center.
Well,
It's on that.
They tore it down, yeah, they tore it down before then because there was a period of time there. The Andrew Jackson was imploded, and there was a period of time that they dug the footing for the Performing Arts Center, and it stood vacant, if you remember, just a huge pool of water for several years. Till we finally, and I think one of your former law partners, Bill Leach, I sponsored the bill in the Senate to erect the Foreman Art Center. Bill Leach was representing Martha and Bronson. Ned was Speaker of the House, and he got on board.
That would have been after 1972. I think I can pin it down because when I was president of the Young Democrats in Nashville, we met at the Andrew Jackson Hotel, and that was 1970. So it would have been 71 or after. Fairly recently then.
Interesting story about the Foreman Art Center. Wilder was Speaker, and we thought we had 16 votes in the Senate, and obviously we needed 17. For some reason, my wife Nancy had gotten very interested in the Performing Arts Center. We had been to lunch one day at the old City Club, which in those days was in the mezzanine floor of the Hermitage. You remember that?
Yep.
We were on the way back from lunch, and I remember I don't remember who all was along, except I know that John Wilder, Nancy, and some other people and myself were walking back from lunch. And Nancy said, "John, I want you to do me a favor," sort of like the Gail Malone story. He said, "Nancy, I'll do anything well for you." "What is it?" "I want you to vote for the Performing Arts bill." He said he went through the whole scenario that I went through with the
Please release me.
But she was not hardly as hard-nosed as Gail. He just said, "Well, I do hope you," and he did. He voted for it.
And that was the
17th vote.
Why don't we take a break for a couple of minutes and
Marvelous.
come back? Bill, tell me a little bit about your family. I know you're a family man, about your wife and your children.
Well, I have, my wife is deceased. She died in September the 14th, 1997. I have 3 daughters. One lives in Nashville, one lives in Birmingham, one lives in Franklin. I have 6 grandchildren, 5 granddaughters, and 1 grandson.
What do your daughters do? Are they homemakers only? Or?
Well, no. The one that lives in Nashville, she's an employee of General Services Department of the State.
Yeah.
The one that lives in Birmingham, she's a lawyer, but she's never practiced. She clerked for Federal District Judge Probst for 2 years, and then the family started coming along, and she said that she wasn't going to do anything until the youngest was out of high school. So the youngest is now a freshman, so I guess it's going to be 4 years. And Whether she'll go back to it or not, I don't know. She's a homemaker. The baby daughter, she lives in Franklin, and she is the with the Department of Revenue. I think her title is Director of Personnel with the
A
Department.
revenuer, huh?
Beg pardon?
A revenuer.
Yes, but I think she's in Director of Personnel with Revenue or something like that. And then I have one granddaughter that Barry knows, who's a graduate of Ole Miss and an accountant, CPA here in town, or I think her office is in Brentwood. I have another granddaughter who went to Baylor and graduated from UT, Baylor in Waco. And she is a special events coordinator for the people to do the Grammys. I forget the name of but she's here in town. And then I have a granddaughter who is a senior in undergraduate school at Vanderbilt now. Another granddaughter who is a sophomore at Ole Miss. Another granddaughter who is a freshman in high school, and a grandson who's in the penitentiary. I kid. He's a freshman at Centennial High School in Franklin.
What, 14 going on 40?
Yeah, I think he's 15. I think she just did turn 15. Now, he's a sophomore instead of a freshman. She's a freshman because they held her back a year. She turned 15 in September.
So you get a chance to see these folks a lot then?
Not as often as I would like, but I see them fairly often. They're all busy. You know how that goes.
Well, let's take a retrospective look, for starting with where you are now. What's your practice like today? Has it changed to any, or?
Oh, my law practice?
Yes.
Well, I'm, for all practical purposes, retired, Steve. I had some health problems back in '96. And even before that, my wife was ill from, very, very ill from '95 to '97. And then I had these heart attack myself. So for all practical purposes, I no longer practice.
Well, I know you're doing something because you and I worked together in a case a year or so ago.
I beg your pardon?
You and I worked together on that
Well,
case.
yeah, I remember that case, and incidentally, you did a marvelous, marvelous job for those people, and they shall forever be indebted to you for it. And I'm
We were honored to work with you.
Well, thank you. But I just don't do much. But my practice had already changed considerably, because I was telling Marcus on the break that about midway of my career, you tried an awful lot of personal injury automobile accident cases. Very rarely did you, both as a plaintiff and a defendant, there's much more, I think. There was some degree of specialization back in those days, but not nearly what it is, I think, now. Medical malpractice was very, very rare. I think I had one plaintiff's I've defended several medical malpractice cases, but I think I had one plaintiff case in my 50 years of practicing law, and it was just so egregious that, just question how much. Legal malpractice was virtually unheard of. Just, you never heard of it.
Better lawyers back then.
I certainly can't say that and wouldn't say that, but I think the society is more litigious today than it was back in those days. And I don't say that necessarily being critical. I know that I read about cases now that I don't think I would have even entertained the idea of bringing a lawsuit about it. I was involved in some substantial lawsuits. I guess perhaps one of the most substantial was we were involved as defendants, was the Waverly explosion case, which happened in 1978.
That train wreck.
Yes. Well, it wasn't a train wreck. It had derailed. Well, it could have been a wreck, yeah. And then this propane tank car erupted and killed, I think, 17 people. destroyed virtually a little block or block and a half, or maybe 2 blocks in our little town, and injured upward of 800 people. Now that's all the way from just the most terrible burns you can think of and survive to maybe a nick or something, but they were lawsuits. As you may or may not know, we took depositions all over the United States virtually, wound up settling the cases. But that was major litigation.
That was one of the more famous cases in the last quarter century in Tennessee, I believe.
It made some wealthy lawyers in Tennessee, and I guess you can well imagine that it created some rift among my little law firm. But you know, to me, there just wasn't any question. We had represented the railroad company for 30 years or longer. And while there wasn't much litigation, what litigation there was, we represented the railroad company. And when this came up, as you can imagine, lots of people were coming to our law firm seeking plaintiffs' representation. And I just said, you know, we can't do it. There's no way. Because it just never was any question to me. It would have been such an obvious conflict that we lost an enormous amount of money as a result of it.
Matter of honor.
Beg pardon?
A matter of honor.
Well, a matter of ethics, of the legal ethics. This is what you do. You know, what's the old saying? You always dance with the one that brung you.
Don't switch sides.
That's right. And I just don't think you can do it. You know, there were some lawyers who had represented railroad companies, the railroad company, in other counties, Williamson, Montgomery, other county. And I don't think that would have been a conflict for them to say we're resigning from our representation of the railroad company. And though it might have been questionable, in my judgment, there just was no question about it in Umphress County, where we had represented them for at least 30 years. And the accident happened there.
How long did it take to settle that case? How long did you work on it?
Oh, gosh. Steve, I can't tell you right now. That case happened in February. The incident happened in February '78, and I guess it was 1980, I guess, before we wound it up.
More than 2 years then.
Yeah, I would say so.
Let me ask you, Bill, to look back. What changes have you seen in the profession that you think are good? And if there are any, what changes in the profession do you think aren't so good?
Well, obviously, I would say that by and large, the lawyers of today are much better educated than the lawyers of my time. When I say my time, I'm going back to the very beginning of my career. You don't remember this, but you've probably heard of it. For a while at Cumberland University, you could go to law school for a year and get your law license and practice law. And there were some awfully fine lawyers that came out of that law school. You did not even have to have an undergraduate degree to go to law school. You could go straight out of high school. And there were some lawyers, and I think one of the lawyers that comes to mind, that if you could take the bar, as I recall, in your senior year, And if you passed the bar, you didn't have to get a degree in order to practice law. Bobby Lee Cook from Somerville, Georgia, is the one who did that at Vanderbilt. I think Bobby Lee and Duck, Senator Henry, were classmates, and Bobby Lee took the bar, passed it, said goodbye. I'm going back to Somerville, Georgia to practice law. I think that the CLE that's now required.
That's continuing legal education.
Yes, it's very beneficial. You know, the requirement to be a member of the bar, I think, the Tennessee Bar Association, that hasn't always been the case. And the Tennessee Bar Foundation has done a marvelous job. And at the risk of sounding immodest, because I am the subject of one of these interviews, I think that these things will, with my exception, will be beneficial to lawyers in the past and to come.
Discipline today, lawyer discipline. Better
I'm sorry.
Lawyer discipline, better or worse? Mechanisms.
Well, now, are you talking about the disciplinary actions that are taken? I think it's probably better. Although I think that I see more and hear of more just outright egregious things that lawyers are doing that we didn't used to hear of that. Maybe it occurred, I don't know, but you didn't hear of it. You know, I've often said that I think lawyers perhaps handle more of other people's money than anyone else, unless it might be the banking profession. And it's even today when the bar has grown so much, you very rarely hear too much of stealing money from clients. Hear it occasionally, and when you hear if there have been disciplinary actions taken, as rightfully it should be, and it's. There's one thing I have a pet peeve against, and I may be stepping on some people's toes when I say this, but if so, so be it. I think that one of the worst things happen in the legal profession when you start advertising. Now, you can argue with me as long as you want to. The First Amendment guarantees that right, and that's a good argument. But I think that when our profession ceased being a profession and became a business, and that's not to say that it hasn't always been a business, but that's bothered me, and it still bothers me. I just don't like to see lawyers advertise. I don't like to see doctors advertise, but that won't bother me as bad as it does lawyers, because I don't care what doctors do particularly.
Any thoughts about maybe doing it differently? If you had another choice, would you go back there and get used to that blood, become a doctor?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I've never regretted for one moment. I've always been glad that I became a lawyer. You know, I wish that I had the resources, that I could have been a more student of the law. And again, I'm going against the grain, what I said a minute ago about it being a business rather than a profession. But, you know, I was faced with the proposition of having to make a living. I worked hard. Took some cases probably that I shouldn't have took.
Well, if you hadn't, you're the only lawyer I've ever met who hadn't.
But, you know, I've often thought that one of the great things, Steve, if a man or woman had the resources to not have to be concerned about making a living, and we all know lawyers like that, but could just pursue it as an intellectual pursuit and trying to do good for people, and particularly your clients, and where you could pick and choose your lawsuits. Well, we can still do that, but
it would be nice.
It would be nice.
Second to the last question, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you wish I had?
I can't think of anything, Steve. I think you've been very thorough. I hope I have answered your questions.
Last question. How would you like to be remembered?
I beg your pardon?
How would you like to be remembered?
How would I like to be remembered? A good father, good husband, good son, and a good lawyer.
Senator,
You know, may I say something?
you certainly may.
I think of Mr. John Hooker Sr., who you knew, and I knew was, he was the epitome of what I thought and what I think a lawyer should be. He was intellectually honest. He was a tremendous, tremendous trial lawyer. Had compassion, I think, for every living human being. I knew him virtually all of my legal career and for a lot of my life. I can never recall hearing that man say one ill word against another human being. I'm sure that he did, but I never heard it. And even today, 32 years after his death, in my judgment, he's still held in great respect and somewhat awe by those who knew him and by a lot of those who did not. And I think maybe sometimes the newspapers now have computers where they plug in, when you mention a man, you say, great trial lawyer, something like that. But you never see an article about him, you know what I mean? I think to be remembered as a man like John Hooker Sr. would be a great honor. Although I could never aspire to that, but you asked me what would I like it to be.
Senator William J. Peeler, it's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate very much your taking your Friday afternoon to do this, and I thank you, Barry. I'm very honored and flattered to be able to participate in this program, and I thank you and the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Thank you.